Hi, my name is Rachel and welcome to my channel. Today we will be going over how to start a watercolor painting by picking out the right type of paper for your project. So, let's get started. To help us better understand our options, we are briefly going to talk about how paper is made. Now, I am going to keep this really super short, so if you want to learn more information, I suggest checking out some of the many fun videos here on YouTube that go over this process both with machine and by hand. But for our purposes, all we really need to know is that paper is made out of a substance called pulp. Pulp can be made out of a variety of materials, such as wood and cotton, and when it goes through the paper-making process, it's mixed with water and sometimes other chemicals, laid on a mesh frame, pressed, and dried. Now, you may be thinking, Rachel, why the heck is this important? Well, it has everything to do with the texture or tooth of our paper. You see, most paper falls into two categories, either hot press paper or cold press paper. And if you haven't guessed it by the use of the temperature words, this just indicates the temperature of the water used when the paper was created, and this is super important. So first, let's talk about hot press paper. Hot press paper is made out of very hot water, and the heat from the water creates a very smooth, textured piece of paper. The smoothness creates a less absorbent sheet, which is great as it allows us to create more fine details and work slower because the paint won't bleed into the fibers of the page. It's also important to note that this type of paper will create the most vibrant colors. And interestingly enough, if you're also interested in creating splatter art, this is the paper I would suggest, and I would use the wet on wet method, which if you're interested in learning watercolor techniques, I suggest you check out this video. Now, moving on. The next paper we're going to be talking about is the most commonly used paper for any watercolor artist, which is cold press paper. Now, cold press paper is made with very cold water and it creates a very rough and bumpy texture. This texture means that the water will absorb more into the page, it will create an aesthetic look, and it is more forgiving as we're able to lift some of that color off if we accidentally make mistakes. It is important to note that cold press paper does create less vibrant colors, and you do want to be a tiny bit more careful with layering as sometimes it can damage the page. So now that we know the two types of paper and their texture, we need to figure out what type of paperweight we're going to use. Now, paperweight refers to how thick or thin a sheet of paper is. The less weight, the thinner the sheet, the more weight, the thicker the sheet. And there are typically three types of weights we use in watercolor. Now, if you are not in the United States, I do apologize. I will be using our scale, which is in pounds. But have no fear, I will list the conversions below in the description, so go ahead and check that out. So the three weights that we use for watercolor paper is 90, 140 pounds, and 300 pounds. Now, 90-pound paper is typically used for drawing, and that is because it doesn't take very much watercolor, meaning you're not going to be able to create very many layers before the paper is going to start to disintegrate, but it is very good for illustration. Next comes the 140-pound paper, which is what I use in my own practice. The important thing to know about 140-pound paper is while it is nice and thick, you still need to stretch it to prevent it from buckling so that you can work on a flat surface. And if that sounded very confusing and you've never stretched paper before, go ahead and check out my watercolor stretching video as I do use 140-pound paper in that video. The last type of paper that we'll be talking about is 300-pound paper, which is the thickest watercolor paper to my knowledge. And it is so thick that it will not buckle and it does not need to be stretched, which is excellent if you do not want to stretch your watercolor paper. The only thing to note is that 300-pound paper tends to be much more expensive, which is why you'll find a lot of artists shy away from that weight. The last thing you're going to want to check for is your paper's archivability. Now, archivable paper just means that it's going to have a very long life because the paper doesn't have acid in it. You see, typical paper is made out of wood, which is very acidic, and over time, the acidity in the page will actually eat your artwork. So we want to be very careful about what kind of paper we're purchasing. For archival paper, the things you want to look for is little logos that say acid-free. It's saying acid-free in the description, or see what the material is made out of, such as cotton or rag. All of those indicate that it is archival and safe, and if you are unsure, definitely check it out on a website and read the description to make sure it either says archival directly or whether it says acid-free. The last thing I want to touch on is price point. Now, typically I purchase higher quality, higher end paper, which tends to be more expensive. I love working on hot press paper, so I love using Arches, and I just started using Fabrino, but they are a bit more on the pricey side, and so if you are looking for a cheaper option, I suggest using Canson or another brand. The only thing to be aware of is the cheaper you go with the watercolor paper, the more likely it'll have some issues with buckling, and there might be some weird things going on with the color, like it might become a little bit patchy, but in general, those are really the only differences between high-end paper and low-end paper, and so I suggest if you're just starting out, it's totally fine to go with low-end paper, but as you want to explore more, I suggest if it's in your budget to try some of the higher end paper because it's going to give you more control and it's going to be more predictable than some of the lower end papers. So to recap, the first thing you're going to do is determine whether or not you want to use hot press or cold press paper based on the control and aesthetic that you're looking for. Then you're going to figure out what kind of weight of paper you need for your project, whether you need something thin or thick. After that, you're going to check for its archivability and end with figuring out what fits in your budget. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, or if you'd like to see more art education videos or stuff from my own practice, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Again, thank you, happy painting, and I look forward to seeing you next time.